Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to webinar 3 of Heritage Matters. I'm talking to you from Shela village outside Ahmedabad in West Indian state of Gujarat. Things are going fine. We'll get there. I hope you're all taking care. Yes, it's challenging, the pandemic, but you know what? We're going to get through this. We're all going to do great after this. And the one thing we're going to do great is we had plenty of time to think about what museums are about. What museums post-pandemic, for example, our civic spaces, what do they mean when everything was closed during the pandemic? And we have a fantastic lineup of panelists this evening, in India this evening, morning in where Alissandra is. So we have Madame Alissandra Cummins, who is the former president of ICOM. She was the president of Museums Association of the Caribbean. When she brought me over to work on the Code of Ethics, I really enjoyed it. And then she was president of UNESCO Executive Board. That's fantastic. I was at the World Heritage Center at that time, and I just saw how she brought consensus, enabled everybody to discuss and do a fantastic job. Alissandra, welcome and thank you for taking the time out and joining us. We really appreciate it. And then we have somebody from, who was a former deputy minister of Berlin, former president of ICOM, Professor Dr. Hans-Martin Hinz. And what Hans-Martin did, in fact, I saw him in Australia because he used to look at German research in Samoa, Tonga, the German archives and so on, always stopped in Canberra. But he also, when he was president of ICOM Germany, he made it the biggest national committee of ICOM. They have over 9,000, almost 10,000 members. But he did something very interesting. He took the committee out of Germany to meet in other places. And then he became the president of ICOM Europe. And he brought people to Vietnam when I was working in Halong Bay. So this kind of outward-looking approach, is really needed post-pandemic. So Professor Hans-Martin Hinz, thank you for joining us and taking the time. And then in our webinars, we try to maintain gender balance, and but we also look at intergenerationality. So we have a young Viennese woman, Elke Kellner. She's the director of Austrian Museums Association, ICOM Austria. And I've seen her firsthand organize amazing, get-togethers, very humble, stands back. Elke, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Vienna. Okay, we are from different parts of the world. I'm from India, Alissandra from the Caribbean, Hans-Martin from Berlin, Elke from Vienna, and then we are assisted by Sharvari Mehta, who is in Ahmedabad, but I haven't seen her for 2 months, but she works for me, believe it, I haven't seen her for 2 months. But thanks, Sharvari, for all your help, and then she has a helper there, I forget his name. It doesn't, I'll remember soon. Okay, let's get going. What we're going to do is each panelist is going to speak for about 8 minutes, focusing on perhaps about 3 things that they think are significant in this post-pandemic situation. And when the 3 panelists have spoken, then you can send questions and Sharvari will consolidate the questions for me. And I will pose the general questions to the panel, the specific ones to individual ones. But please, feel free to pose questions, but make them relevant to what we are trying to do. So post-pandemic, we're still during the pandemic. Alissandra, I think one of the best interviews that I've ever seen in my life by Amanpour on CNN is with the Prime Minister of Barbados. It was like it sums up what leadership is about. People with the pandemic are thinking about the big countries, We know that neither Paris nor New York nor London have had any answers, so, but they're forgetting that there are 53 small island development states, 53 countries in the world. They're the ones which are affected by climate change that is actually, responsible for this pandemic in many places. And, with, everybody knows with the water levels rising, with global warming, small island states like Kiribati, Tuvalu are disappearing. So it's wonderful that somebody who knows, who is highly knowledgeable about SIDS, who actually lives, born, brought up, resident in a SIDS country, is actually with us this evening, and she's going to kickstart this evening's panelists presentations. Alissandra, all over to you.
Thank you, Amar. Good evening, friends. Good morning, wherever you are. Good afternoon. I think I'm going to call this statement a meditation on museums as a state of mind. A key factor governing my reflections today are these three themes, if you like, or three subjects or topics that underpin what I'm going to talk about. Firstly, that museums are not just educational, they are essential. Secondly, vulnerability can breed resilience. And thirdly, that 100 is not just a number. Each of these three themes underpin the reality of museums every day, but perhaps should be understood to be part of the DNA of museums in small island developing states, and of course in small states. We are also fundamentally affected, as you said, Amar, by the effects of climate change, though not always in the way one might imagine. I'm not really going to discuss these themes in any order of priority, neither do I see them as truly separate in any real sense of the word, but rather they're all intertwined and integrated in my mind. So museums are not just educational, but as I've come to understand, they are essential. They're essential to our well-being as communities. They may not be like hospitals or armies or schools, essential to survival of communities, although I think that is arguable. But they are essential to helping our population thrive thereafter. They may not have been assigned an official value as a functional unit of government in the same way that even libraries and archives are incorporated. And yet societies and communities every day the world over signal, even if they don't articulate it, that the museum, especially the community or small museum, is essential to them, essential to their needs, to their sense of self, and to their community. But museums do have a critical role to play, not just as storehouses of a nation's history or of its memory, but in the way that they reflect, recover, and restore hidden or forgotten chapters in that history. Museums are also the markers and even the makers sometimes of identity. The critical issue really is to understand that it undertakes such processes at the instance and with the involvement and the investment of the communities they serve. One of the first things which we could do following lockdown as a result of this pandemic was to assert to our ministry that while we fully understood that we were not an essential service, that there were many ways in which we could help to serve, to stabilize the community. If there's one thing that COVID-19 has done for us, it has caused us to pause and reflect on the historical experience of our country following an epidemic. For Barbados, that was the 1854 cholera outbreak, which provided us with lessons historically about the strategies then developed and the actions then taken, and to remind us that we can and should learn from our history to know and understand how our communities thrive, how they survive, and then thrive following such an enormous suffering and destruction. We knew and understood this, and could share that knowledge with our leadership. As collections from museums that reflect the life and the history and the identity not only of a community, but also in effect of humanity that was in danger of disappearing, there was critical work to be done. For me, the work that we've been engaged with since 2016 with the University of the West Indies, with ICOM, and with other members of the consortium EU-LAC Museums has been critical to helping us understand and appreciate how passionate communities are about safeguarding their heritage, how committed they are to communicating it to future generations. Museums are therefore a crucial factor in mitigating climate change based on our efforts to preserve our heritage, our identity, our existence. Communities can and should be empowered to co-create, co-curate, and communicate their knowledges, their skills, and their practice that are essential to the mental health and well-being of a nation and the recovery and resilience of a people. Well, vulnerability can also breed resilience. For me, 2004 was momentous in many ways. It was the year in which I had been elected to my first term as president of International Council of Museums. And it was also the year in which the articulation of a key resolution around the importance of incorporating intangible cultural heritage into the day-to-day work of museums was also a source of considerable satisfaction and inspiration. And I was looking forward to bringing this resolution to life in the professional practices that we as ICOM instituted. However, all those plans came to an abrupt end. And following the catastrophic impact of the tsunami strike on Banda Aceh in Indonesia that occurred on the 26th of December 2004, everything else came to a halt for us, while the death toll and the destruction continued to rise. While we remained helpless, if not hopeless, in the wake of this human catastrophe. 10 years before in Barbados, it had achieved the signal importance of being the first SIDS to host a major UN meeting on its own. The issues of climate change and sea level rise had been identified and articulated as the major driving forces affecting populations, agricultural lands, and infrastructures concentrated on low-lying areas in various regions, and that any rise in the sea level would have significant and profound effects on the settlements, living conditions, and island economies. 10 years on from that conference, the Barbados Plan of Action, articulating the small island developing states are particularly vulnerable to global climate change, climate variability, and sea level rise. And you can guess this tsunami was a direct example of what can happen with the low-lying countries threatened, brought home in graphic detail. For us in ICOM, the response in the end was the establishment of the Disaster Relief for Museums, first created to provide assistance to museums damaged by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. We knew and understood that these entities could not and would not be priorities for national recovery efforts. They were not understood to be essential to the recovery of a nation, but we knew that as part of injured communities that they could be, if only given the chance to be. We thus established the Disaster Relief for Museums, encompassing 3 pillars: the task force, the relief fund, and the relief website. And we then, after that period, extended the mandate to worldwide activities, including man-made disasters, such as armed conflict, and following up on the development and prioritization of capacity building. The DRFM has continued to develop and evolve over the decade and a half since then. And I do hope that we can properly recognize and celebrate its 15th anniversary this year. But we have found also that museums, particularly in SIDS, can and do step up to the plate and provide critical help, support, and succor to our communities in times of disaster. Within the last 10 years, there have been excellent examples of Caribbean museums, for example, in Puerto Rico, in Dominica, in other locations, providing support to stricken communities. In Puerto Rico, particularly, one museum provided space for children to receive their classes following the destruction of their schools after a hurricane. And the extraordinary activism of the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, which responded to helping its nation through recovery after the landfall of Hurricane Dorian, with its commitment to active nurturing the recovery and health and spirit and peace of Bahamians and its migrant Haitian population, was a signal example of how museums can help after a period of trauma, loss, and transition. This organization provided support to its communities, including its first responders, with access to alternative modes of healing and critical engagement. That is why, my dear colleagues, I like to remind us that museums are not just educational, they are essential. They're essential to the mental health, the well-being, and the resilience of our communities. And then 100. 100 is not just a number. I might argue actually that it's a state of mind. I don't think that there are many here who would doubt why World War II veteran Captain Tom Moore would be counted amongst my heroes today. Having completed 100 laps of his garden by his 100th birthday to raise a fantastic amount of money to support the NHS in the UK, he continues to inspire with his positive outlook and has stated that once the lockdown is over, the war hero is determined to walk around the streets and say hello to people. He also is hoping to stretch his legs abroad. He said, I would like to go back to India again and to Barbados and maybe the continent. That is something I would love to do, but at 100, he said, with a quiet chuckle, you've got a certain time limitation. Well, I think he got the mix right. He wants to go back to India again, your home country, Amar, one of the largest countries in the world and one of the most fascinating and deeply embedded in our cultural psychology. And of course, he wants to come to Barbados, one of the smallest countries in the world, and also the home, I would like to argue, of one of the largest populations of centenarians in the world. Why is that, ladies and gentlemen? There is a rationale, and it's not just the drinking water. So as someone celebrating his 100th birthday this year, he will definitely fit right in. And you can be assured that his friends in Barbados would definitely look forward to that conversation and to his visit. Barbados cherishes its centenarians and are doing what it can to get to know about their lives and their careers and to understand what their contributions have been. But I think that we can see that what it really is that each of these individuals is essentially a community museum in and of themselves, and clearly demonstrate why 100 is not just a number, but a state of mind. Their resilience and their capacity have been sterling examples to us all. I would like to wrap up by saying that for many of us, completely in a matter of days and weeks, many of us are trying to understand how to take care of things, how to take care of our staffs, of our country, of our collections, of our institutions, and of ourselves, trying to work out what our new normal is. But it's only more imperative in these difficult times when immense inequities that exist within global society and institutions are made even more visible, that we need to center equity and inclusion in our decision-making processes and actions. There is a need for understanding why a region as small and vulnerable and under-resourced like the Caribbean, made up of 20 states, could cope with and manage its response to the scourge of the coronavirus epidemic, to the point where, far from being devoured and destroyed by the pandemic, it was able, in fact, to roll out its emergency response program and put things into place and be positioned with a well-prepared health service based on our strategies of testing and containment of Zika and other viruses previously, and we were never in danger of being as overwhelmed as was the case elsewhere. So across these 20 countries, we suffered a total low death toll of 84 victims and are emerging relatively unscathed, able to move forward to a slow, gradual, carefully orchestrated return to normalcy. if we can even understand what our new normal might be. But what I can tell you is that while many may be astonished by this relative success, we understand it completely, because our normal has become the disruption and the devastation of natural disasters, the instabilities and shifts between one state and another. So our new normal is basically our old normal. We will continue to survive and thrive. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alissandra. It's very moving, and in many ways, you've actually sort of gave a new meaning to the whole question of what is resilience, and also in the post-pandemic situation, what would people think is the new normal? Who determines what the new normal is? Are we going to go back to the old ways? Are we going to build on what we've learned and move forward? And there, I think, as you said, museums are not just educational. Museums are essential. Thank you for those very deeply meaningful, reflections. We'll come back to you with the questions soon. But now over to Professor Hans-Martin Hinz. Over to you. Professor Hans-Martin Hinz, you're Chancellor, and you have a fantastic Minister for Culture, who actually came out, I think the first country to come out in Europe and say that we're going to allocate X billion euros, whatever, for culture. And that was just like what we needed, in the rest of the world. Now, as a former deputy minister from Berlin, as a former president of ICOM and many other hats that you wore throughout your life, can you tell us how Germany is actually, through a policy basis, how it's going to deal with the post-pandemic situation, how it's opening up? Over to you, Professor Hans-Martin Hinz.
Okay, thank you very much, Amar, and good afternoon from Berlin. And I wish all of you a great International Museum Day. It's 18th of May today. And this is the first International Museum in a very surrealistic time. As Professor Galla told us already, I would speak a little bit about the situation, the current situation in Germany, in Berlin, and about the financial aid programs. By now, we do not have a full overview about the impact of the crisis on museums. Certainly, there are at least already massive budget losses everywhere in every museum, and especially smaller museums and expensive exhibition projects are full of concern about their future, but others as well. As in many other countries, the more than 7,000 museums in Germany had to shut down for about 7 weeks. Since early May, they reopened eventually and with care, while other cultural institutions in Germany, like theaters, orchestras, opera houses, are still closed, and this will last for a while. Museum staff with contracts have not lost their jobs, but those who work not in but for museums, the freelancers, have as extremely economic problems, and supplying companies fear to survive. Traditionally, in Germany, there is a high expectation that the state is responsible for supporting museums and other cultural institutions. And indeed, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, in an address to the cultural sector, spoke about the importance of culture in the service for society and promised to help. Like in other European countries, there are a few general and a few very special and new financial aid programs which shall help. There is a national aid program, 50 billion euros, for so-called solo independent and small business companies, those who have applied have received already a sum between 9,000 and 30,000 euros in just a few days in order to survive. But this program is valid for only 3 months. Short-time allowances prevent people from losing their jobs. Companies get the money for their employees and start first with 60% of the income, later 70% and up to 80%. And receivers are allowed to earn additional money during that time. This program is limited to the end of the year. Companies themselves get loans in order not to get bankrupt in the near future. Until now, this general policy is working out very well. Unemployment rate is still low, for 4% in the country, but we are still at the beginning of the crisis. So it will get up, but let's wait and see. If cultural institutions under federal responsibility, museums included, had to cancel artist performances, then these institutions can pay them the forfeit up to 2,500 euros for every single canceled event and will be reimbursed. Especially smaller museums with limited budgets need financial support in order to guarantee social distancing in the museum buildings. Those museums can apply for a sum between 10 to 50,000 euros from a special 10 million euros fund by the central government, and this fund is called Restart. Like for museums, there are as well new financial aid programs for orchestras, film productions, and there are new scholarships for performing arts and music called Reload program. Nevertheless, artists and others, museums as well, complain that the current programs are probably not huge enough and the government should do more for them. In Germany, due to the constitution of the country, culture, education, and research are under the responsibility of the 16 states and the local authorities. Only less than 10% of the museums are central state institutions. Consequently, in the corona crisis, the 16 states have as well developed aid programs for their institutions, often co-financing federal programs. These programs are very important, but since there are richer and poorer states, areas of the country, at the moment the support is not everywhere the same. Bavaria, a richer state, for example, offers a 140 million special budget for its cultural sector in danger. Others have less, but anyway, these are tremendous sums. Let us be brave and watchful. That is what Germany's chancellor said in the crisis to the cultural people. And right now, the Minister of Finances and the Minister of Culture, together with the representatives of the states, are working out a stimulus package for culture, museums included, which is meant to stabilize the cultural landscape of Germany in the long run. Parliament will decide about it in early June. We all do not know by now if all these aid programs will have a sustainable effect and will prevent the cultural sector from collapses. But in my view, it was a very good beginning in the first few weeks and months. This is the current situation in Germany. And if you want to check the situation in other European countries, the situation of museums in other European countries, I would recommend the final report of the Network of European Museum Organizations, NEMO. they did a survey already in all the European countries. 48 countries were invited, and you will find out there are similar developments, similar problems, but it's interesting to see how the situation is over there. And Professor Galla asked me as well if there is a museum in Berlin. He has heard about a new museum dealing with climate change and others. I can just say that all the contemporary subjects and problems and themes we discussed before Corona still prevail, of course, and museums need to continue working on the themes like social and technical developments, like, as I said, climate change. The dialogue of the global north with the global south is important, and many others. And I wonder if our museums are in the position to do a kind of sustainable work concerning these themes. I know many museums all over do a lot of work concerning these subjects, but here in Berlin there's a very new institution called Futurium, House of Futures. It is more than just a museum, a science more than a science center, more than a technical museum. It is an institution which has a main question: how do we want to live in the future? And isn't it exactly the question we need to discuss, especially now, and to include the experiences of the current situation. This institution is established already in 2014 as a public limited company, but only recently opened to the public. And this is run by the German Ministry of Education and Research and supported by the large German science organizations and big companies like Siemens, Telecom, and others, all these who invest a lot in important future developments. But since this museum, this institution is just open for a few weeks before Corona arrived our area, so there's not much to say about the success and about the details, but they are working on all these future questions, artificial intelligence, cultural expressions in the future, and so on. Exactly that what museums do as well. But let's wait and see if this is probably a model for a new development also for the classical museums. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Am I still muted? No. Thank you, Professor Hans-Martin Hinz. Yes, what kind of future do we want to live with? I mean, that museum and its mission is really important. We're talking about post-pandemic situations. Do you want to live like before, or do you want to move forward? What are our preferred futures in terms of how we want to live? And of course, it would differ from place to place, given the enormous diversity in the world. But we look forward to reading more about how Germany takes this forward. And you mentioned small museums, you mentioned resilient funding strategies and so on. And the NEMO report. And one of the people who contributed to the NEMO report, because she's part of the NEMO network, is Elke Kellner, who is our next panelist, but she also has to deal with small museums. So I really would like to ask you, Elke, if you could tell us how, as the director of ICOM Austria, dealing with the Museums Association, what is your role as a professional body in dealing with this? Could you please share with us your perspectives?
Thank you, Amar. It's a great pleasure to join you here today. In my statement, I would like to focus on 3 points: the current situation in Austria and in Europe, aspects of diversity and inclusion during the crisis, and how those affect museums, and on how sustainability could transform museums during and after this crisis. So please let me quickly run through these points. As lockdowns now gradually come to an end in several regions and countries of Europe, museums had to revise and update their health and security protocols to reopen. The majority of museums in Europe and around the globe have been closed in March and April and are just now opening up to the public again in May and June. ICOM Austria has been in close contact with our Ministry of Culture to prepare special regulations for museums who were allowed to open up here again since May 15, though most Austrian museums will open by the end of May. It is our foremost goal to protect the health of both visitors and staff during this pandemic and to avoid infections, of course. At the same time, we are eager to open up our museums and provide spaces for communication, interaction, study, and enjoyment. Educational programs will be allowed with a maximum group size of 10 people, wearing masks and keeping the safe distance of 1 meter apart, and events with an attendance of around 100 people will be allowed in June, we hope. To give you some perspective on the situations of European museums, I would like to cite the NIMU report and quoting the recent survey they published. Many museums reported a considerable loss of income of about 75 to 80%, which larger museums and museums in touristic areas reporting the highest losses. There has been about 1.55 million euros of income loss in Austrian museums per week. So all museums are massively financially affected by the COVID-19 crisis and need a quick raise in public funding to keep their staff and collections safe. The majority of museums in Europe have not had to lay off staff yet. However, 3 out of 10 museums have put on hold contracts with freelance workers. I would like to add that the COVID-19 crisis severely threatens museums' education staff. Many museum educators have suddenly lost their unstable jobs with no financial backup and a very uncertain and long-term hope to be called in again when museums will reopen. No technology appliance can and should replace education personnel in museums. ICOM SICA, our international committee, strongly urges museums to secure these jobs and to provide them with permanent employment as regular staff members. Museums are directly and heavily impacted by the global decrease of tourism. Beyond the immediate crisis, OECD had predicted a 50 to 70% decrease in global tourism activities worldwide. A long-term dramatic decrease of income through museum tickets, shops, and cafes is expected at least until the end of 2020, more likely affecting us also in 2021. 4 out of 5 museums have increased their digital services and social media activities to reach their audiences. Most half of the respondents stated that their museum is now providing more or several new online services. So museums have reported an increase of online visits ranging between 10 and 150%. ICOM International is currently analyzing the outcome of a worldwide survey to provide data on how the ongoing COVID-19 outbreak is affecting the museum sector around the world. A global vision will help us give a stronger and clearer response on how museums can be supported in this difficult time. One thing is for sure, museum operations as we used to know them will not be the same for a long time. Secondly, I want to briefly discuss aspects of diversity and inclusion during the crisis and how they are affecting museums. Museums have been quick and very active in their response, adapting to the new situation of the pandemic, shifting their focus to addressing needs within their communities in this situation. For example, museums donated masks and gloves from their conservation departments to hospitals. Museums contributed to the reduction of isolation and loneliness by increasing their digital services to engage people staying at home. Museums stimulated a sense of trust and community by requesting people to share objects and stories to preserve and to learn from this moment. Museums maintained their informal educational role remotely by providing quizzes, games, and education materials online. From surveys of people responding to the digital programs of museums, we learned that digital visitors were looking for social interaction, fun, distraction, or something to read. Most of you will have seen or contributed to the Tableau Vivant challenges, where people recreate works of art with objects they found at home during the Corona self-quarantine. This has been a great way to encourage audiences to engage with museum collections. ICOM Austria has set up a Padlet to gather and show the many digital initiatives the museums are doing here in Austria. And we were able to see that also many small museums were very active on social media, mainly on Facebook and also on Instagram. Many museums started collecting objects to document the Corona crisis and invited people to give them those objects and to document the experience of the local community. There were many examples of great online storytelling, like recommendations for cultural walks outside in towns or in the countryside. Museums were also posting objects from their collection, highlighting connections to the local communities. Many museum directors and curators presented objects from their collections on YouTube, though there were not so many other staff members present in most cases. So to speak of diversity, it might also be interesting for digital audiences to hear from conservators, educators, or volunteers telling their stories about the museum. And I would like to end with a short statement on how sustainability could transform museums during and after this crisis. The lockdown on international tourism and travel has brought the whole cultural sector to a harsh stop. Big blockbuster exhibitions who are attracting higher and higher numbers of visitors will not be possible for quite some time. We were used and very used to reaching higher and higher visitor records every year, proving the relevance of museums to the public. Public funding also mainly relies on these high visitor numbers as basis to judge their quality. The COVID-19 crisis could be a possibility to focus more strongly on the important role of museums for society and for the communities that surround them, providing a space for communication, for discussion, for enjoyment, to focus on the role of museums as trusted institutions, providing scientific facts and making them accessible to diverse audiences, and to focus on the ability of museums to build a common ground of understanding based on cultural exchange and dialogue. We have to remind our governments of the important role museums are playing. We have to remind them that to provide public funding for culture and museums is not a luxury, it's a necessity. We have to remind our governments that museums are not only or mainly generating financial income or promoting tourism, but that museums are institutions storing our memories. By connecting the past and the future, museums provide us with a perspective for the here and now. Thank you.
Thank you, Elke. Necessity from from essential that Alissandra said, we've come to the funding is a necessity. And you also emphasize that we have to remind governments So advocacy is really critical, and that's one of the things that our professional bodies do, and that's what Elke does so well. And thank you. Now we have all the three panelists present there, different perspectives, very moving and very, very moving and very timely. Now, we can take questions. Please keep questions short, because don't write an essay, please. It's very difficult for us to deal with them. Okay, I'm going to go through them. We might not be able to answer all of them given the time limits, but I just want to go to the first one. Alissandra, this is addressed to you. Somebody who worked in Barbados and came back to India is saying that, are there examples of projects specifically dealing with mental health in post-disaster rehabilitation that you are aware of? This is from Nimalka Pasanha.
Hi, Nimalka. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any specific projects that are currently ongoing at this time. But what I did realize was that the work that was being done by the National Gallery of the Bahamas took us into a completely different realm of experience. And it is something that I think needs to be better investigated and understood, because the role of the museum is not just as a storehouse or even as an educational institution, but there's something fundamental to its role as a kind of place of sanctuary, so that it can span both the activity of providing, as did the National Gallery in Bahamas, providing actual classes and events and even sessions to help with mental health. I think it's important that we reflect that not enough attention is given to mental health issues in a crisis, but as we have seen played out across the board in every country where they're affected by this virus, that mental health is critical to ensuring capacity to overcome and to survive and then to thrive. And I think that museums, being a place of trust in many instances, do provide an opportunity for that. So while I'm not aware of any specific activities going on, I think it is an issue that needs attention and that should be worked on as something that where we could develop proper protocols and codes, but also institutionalize these, not just for the mental health of our colleagues and our staff, but to provide those opportunities for others also. Thank you for the question.
Okay, the next question from SS Prasad is, I'm summarizing here because these are long. I think I've disappeared again. SS Prasad is that how can, the pandemic has had a devastating impact on craftspeople. Like in India, for example, 5.5 lakh, that's about 550,000, more than 500,000 people who are weavers, their looms are lying idle. So, so in reviving, how in dealing with the impacts on intangible heritage and crafts, and then revitalizing them, reviving them post-pandemic, what is the role of museums? That's a question that, if you could note it, I'm going to read out some of the questions before we answer them. So if you panelists could note that. And so post-pandemic strategies, how are they to be articulated by museums at all levels, not just national, regional, state, but also community. And I think that Elke actually addressed this. And it's expected that museums may not open till beginning of next year due to huge financial crunch. How to reconnect community with their collections. That's going to be a challenge. And so these are, and then another question for inclusive growth of museum, what should we do during COVID-19 period? And so, oh, there's a specific one to Elke. Oh dear. So I think people should stop sending messages. They're very distractive. Will be the Elke will be the reservation-based visit workout while opening museums. So those are some of the questions. You might want to answer them. Who's going to go first? Elke, you might want to go first. Come on.
All right. So I'll try maybe to point out the special regulations for the museums first. We tried to establish a maximum number of visitors that are allowed into the museums now. So we have one visitor needs a space of 10 square meters. So we have the whole square meter of the museum, all the rooms and aulas and everything accessible to visitors, and we divide them per 10, and then we have the number of visitors that we can allow in. And they have to inside keep the distance of 1 meter apart, and everybody has to wear a mask, unfortunately. Otherwise, we have regulations put in place for personnel, for staff members, mainly for cashiers who sell the tickets, that they have special plexiglass walls to keep them safe and distanced from the visitors. And we have regulations for our visitor service personnel that they remind people to keep the distance and to keep in the regulations. All in all, the regulations that apply for museums are not that different from the regulations that apply for normal society in closed rooms. So we were very happy that we could get those regulations like they are, and that museums are not treated worse than maybe big shopping centers. So we are allowed to open again and don't have stricter regulations. And maybe I add with reconnecting with the museum collections, many small museums try to find some connection in their collections, in the objects they have. We had some religious museum who have objects from Catholic collections. So they remembered Sankt Corona, a holy person whose name is in touch with the Corona crisis, and she was a saint for different plagues, and they told her story. So they try to find connections in the objects in their collections, or they tell stories about the environment, about the cities or villages they live in, about the history, about maybe the plague that has been there during Renaissance time, or the Spanish fever that was on the change of the century, 1900. And so to give people a perspective on those topics and show how people reacted in the past and how we are reacting to them in the current times.
Thanks, Elke. Anyone else, other panelists? Hans Martin, would you like to comment?
When I think about inclusion and sustainability in the Corona crisis, I am sometimes a bit concerned about changes we can recognize, not for the better. I mean, and it started already before Corona. You can see there's a kind of renationalization in the countries, in politics, in elections. And this has an impact on cultural policy as well, and on museum work. So museums did a lot for inclusion and for sustainability. Inclusion, I mean, for example, the dialogue with other cultures, with other areas in the past and present, the multi-perspective exhibitions they developed over the decades. And this was really a progress, really a success. And I have the impression that in several countries, this has changed in the meantime. And museums are not just asked, but forced to change their programs, to deal with more local or national or patriotic themes instead of multi-perspective global themes. And in so far, you can call it an exclusion instead of inclusion. And I'm a little bit concerned how this will continue.
Thanks, Hans Martins. Alissandra? Is Alissandra there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Do you have any comments?
Yeah. I think that that really my colleagues have answered perfectly for me. I see a number of resonances with a lot of the activity that Elke had outlined, had seen that the have seen that the activities that really resonated the most, though, with our community during this lockdown period were activities where we were not just giving information to the public, but we were inviting engagement. In other words, we were inviting dialogue. We're asking them to contribute their knowledge. We're asking their involvement in discovering new things. And for us, the engagement of community members has been extremely important and extremely encouraging. And in fact, it has given us an opportunity which we hadn't anticipated a year ago or even 6 months ago, where because of the dialogue, because of the continued conversation that's going on around the kinds of things that are important to the community, we have said, all right, then, one of our major projects, which is starting this year, is a complete redesign of our permanent exhibits. It's been very, very important to us, very exciting time and opportunity for us to renew and revitalize the museum. But this particular situation has brought us into much closer proximity with our community. And we're saying to them, we're inviting them. In fact, our invitation has been extended as of today on International Museums Day. We're inviting them to please tell us your stories. Tell us what you found important. Tell us why you found it meaningful. Help us to decide what should be the central themes that govern our development as a nation, and that should find a place in these new heritage, these new historical galleries. So it's a very exciting opportunity, and we're looking to developing that dialogue and continuing the conversation, because in this way, for the first time, we will have complete community engagement and involvement from the start of the process, and not just at instances as we're going along.
Thanks, Alissandra. You've actually answered another question there where people were talking about the concern was about community engagement, as a result of the pandemic. I think you gave a very good example. There are a number of questions and comments that have come up dealing with For example, just before the pandemic, there was intense discussion on return, repatriation, and restitution of African cultural heritage from European museums to Africa. That conversation has ceased. There was very intense, commitment approach to making museums accessible. The issues of repatriation, issues of accessibility, where all these, because people are not talking about them, they're talking about digital access and virtual tools, but all those things are not being talked about. And this is a time we could actually talk about. I mean, that's what somebody is saying is, we're sitting in our museums, we're in the digital domain. Could we have some discussions about some of these issues? Could we have some discussions about, one of the concerns is, what about people of color in Europe who have huge challenges in accessing and going to museums? I mean, can we have discussion, digitally, as we sit in our museum? So there are very large number of interesting questions, but there's also concern that all those things that we fought so hard to put on the agenda in terms of inclusion are just falling off the table because people are focusing only on the economics, on the establishment and the people that are there. And, there's people from Netherlands, young people concerned that post-pandemic, will there still be opportunities for young people in Dutch museums or any of the European museums? So there's different kinds of, and then we have Dr. Skye Morrison from Toronto. Of course, the people from Toronto would remember her, will know her. She was on our previous webinar. She's asking a simple question. Will museums collect again? How soon will museums collect again? With financial crisis, is it going to be hit hard? How are we going to deal with that? And then there's also the question about, given the financial constraints, how do people look after the collections? Do they have, staff? Do they have the resources to look after the collections? And so these are some of the general concerns that are coming through. And the question of Elke talked about tourism and the decline of tourism. And I said right in the beginning, some of you might have missed that, 83% of World Heritage sites are closed, museums are closed. And tourism, it'll take a long time for it to get back. And so the question is, I want to put it to you all because several people are concerned about it, is in the revitalization and reopening of museums, can the museums and the tourism sectors work together collaboratively? What are the synergies over there? I'll leave it to you. Who wants to lead that? Sandra, you start off because you're the kid. Yes.
Let's see. So, should museums and tourism work together? Was that the main question? I think there's an inevitability about it, particularly in small island states and in the Caribbean, where many of our economies are driven, have tourism as the mainstay of it. They're anywhere between 60, 70, 80, and even 90% of the economy is driven by tourism, so that it's not something that that any of our museums are disconnected with. I think what we have to understand, however, is what do we mean by tourism? None of the exhibitions or the programs or the events that we currently put on at the museum are driven first and foremost by tourism. Mm. What we say is our core mission is that we are displaying, we are discussing, we are interpreting our heritage, our cultural, natural, our historical, if you like, heritage, for first and foremost, for Barbadians. For Barbadians to have the opportunity to understand and appreciate them, and for them to be able to discover them and to share them with their children and their grandchildren. And our premise is that if you do this well, then your tourists are going to enjoy them too. I think that we have all seen a change in the kind of person that makes up the tourism population. I mean, with the best will in the world, one cannot suggest that people are coming to Barbados or the Caribbean just to go on the beach, when beaches are often much closer to home. So then what is it they're coming to the Caribbean for? And it's not, since it's not just about the tourism experience of traveling and going on the beach, it must be because there's something it's sort of inculcated by your involvement with a community. There must be something distinctive about that community, and it's usually both or either the natural heritage, the unique qualities of it, or the distinctiveness of the cultural heritage, which they want to enjoy, they want to get up close to, they want to appreciate, they want to be immersed in, and to share. And I think that what we found with most small and developing states is that they're good at sharing. They're good at recognizing museums, not just as storehouses, but as, if you like, catalysts for creativity. And in that creativity, many, many new programs then emerge that allow tourists to engage and to enjoy. And I think once we are satisfied that our visitors are enjoying, we also enjoy that too. So first and foremost, the museums are about the local population. They are about what the local population finds important. But it's also about the local population being able to share of itself, its culture, its heritage, its identity, and wanting others to enjoy it. And I think those things come together very well in the kinds of initiatives that many of us are undertaking. I want to say here a special thank you to our Ministry of Tourism, for example, who took the initiative of including our museum in the development of the new tourism development program. And in so doing has enabled us to gain significant funds for the kind of redesign, redevelopment I'm taking, I mentioned earlier. But the important thing was that tourism ministry acknowledged the importance of having something like the Barbados Museum and other heritage sites and institutions involved in reflections and in changing and updating our view of what we can offer to tourists. And I think that's a very important shift in the paradigm which we are all, museums, population, and visitors alike, are going to benefit from. Thanks.
Thank you, Alissandra. Elke, do you want to go?
Yeah, if you allow me to just contribute maybe another perspective. As I'm sitting here in Vienna with very many big institutions, museum institutions that have the big blockbuster exhibitions. I'm talking about the Kunsthistorische Museum or the Albertina collection we have here in Vienna. And of course they have big shows, and financially those big exhibitions will only kind of financially work out if you have more than 300,000 visitors. So they are very dependent on tourism and on the income tourism has, and not only the museums, of course, but the whole tourism sector as hotels and restaurants and everything that is connected with that. So it would be very interesting, in my point of view, to find new ways of tourism and museums work together sustainably. So does it make sense for 300,000 people to travel by plane in between Vienna, other European cities, international cities, to come and see just one exhibition? On the contrary, not to fall back on the nationalization that Hans-Martin Hinz mentioned, and we really see implications of that also in neighboring countries like Hungary that used the COVID-19 crisis to put up laws that kind of almost eliminates the power of parliament and make Mr. Orban kind of putting on a government of himself. So the sustainability and in that kind of view, to have tourists coming and to have the cultural exchange and not build up borders as we have it at the moment, where all the borders are closed still to the neighboring countries. We hope to open up those borders soon, but there will be just a possibility of exchange within Europe, maybe, but nothing of tourism or people coming to Vienna from all over the world. So this will take some longer time, I'm afraid. And we have to find ways to internationally communicate and to find ways of sustainable tourism, maybe traveling by train, maybe to find other ways, maybe to have longer trips, to not be flying on planes all the time. And I hope that in this time of crisis, people are thinking about ways to do that and that we can develop new solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Elke. Hans-Martin.
Can I come back to the subject collections in colonial context you mentioned?
Right.
We all know that, and it was heavily discussed, that it all started politically by the French president two and a half years ago, when he gave a speech in Ouagadougou about the importance of the collections in colonial context for the African countries. But at the same time, maybe earlier in Berlin, we are discussing a completely new project called Humboldt Forum. This is a project more than a museum. It's a forum. It's and the museums discuss the question: how shall we present cultures globally nowadays? Is it the way ethnological museums are doing it, or how shall we do it multi-perspectively together with people from the global South? And when the discussions continued, so the question was raised, what about the collections? And from this very moment, the question or this theme got a publicity in the country and is heavily discussed everywhere. And the result is that, it's not finished, of course, the result is that the government, the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Education, and all the ministries of the 16 states started a project to introduce the history of colonialism to the curricula in schools, at schools and universities. And so you have a wonderful example how museums can foster an important social discussion, a global discussion to the general public. And because many people of our time have no idea about the colonial past. Even in Germany, I think 95% have no idea that Germany once was a colonial power and had colonies in Africa, China, and the Pacific. But it is so important that in order to understand the current developments in the world, to understand the problems, the migration problems and all that, it's important to speak about what happened 100 or 200 years ago. And it's great that museums were in the position to push the discussion, and that politics and the general public have accepted that and are doing a lot to continue and to foster the discussion.
Thank you, Hans Martin. That's great that you have colonialism introduced into school curricula. I hope, you know, those of us who are, I'm Australian, of Indian background, both in India and Australia, we hope that United Kingdom will follow the German example, because despite all efforts, they refuse to teach, you know, history of colonialism in the British schools. Alissandra, your example of how Barbados approaches is wonderful in terms of, you know, Barbados museums are for Barbadians first. And the one country in which I worked in for a long time is Vietnam, which has really not been affected by COVID, very minimal. In fact, not a single death and very small numbers. The country has fared really well. And one of the very early decisions in 2000, working with UNWTO, the Master Plan for Tourism Development, Vietnamese decided, you know, that culture and museums have to be relevant for local people first. And they have to be, the local ownership is important. When that is achieved, people have a choice. They might want to open a few things for, you know, they might have a few things that they might open up for the tourists, visitors. They might not want others. You know, so the whole question of public-private space was debated quite a bit. What is private for local people is private. And this is something that's also come up in some of the comments, that what is really good for local people. This is a very interesting comment. The comment says, heritage community, first the people who lives in the place. And this is also the right choice for the best experience for the visitors of the place. Is it the right choice? That's a very important question, because that which is important for local people needs to be honored and respected. And, but in several countries, what's happening is tourism and attracting tourists has become so significant that they're Disneyfying the local heritage. So the Disneyfication of local heritage and experiences is taking place. So you have this McDonald's phenomenon. And so there are huge challenges as we go along. And I'm going through, you know, one of the things that's coming up in a lot of comments and questions is not only those issues such as all forms of access, irrespective of ability or disability, if you will, return and repatriation of colonial collections, Africa, for example, from Europe, people of color, you know, most people of color who are employed in museums, a question particularly refers to Europe. They don't have permanent jobs. With their jobs will be renewed, or will, you know, post-pandemic situation become a whitening effect on European museums. And one could say the same thing in many other parts of the world too. And and then there's one kind of advocacy that are we collecting the impact of the pandemic? If you're not actually collecting, you know, the question is, if you're not going to have funds to even run the museums, we stop collecting, will the memory of the pandemic be lost because we don't collect the stories, we don't collect those tangible things related to the pandemic? So these are the kinds of comments and questions that are coming across, that all those, because we're talking about, there's someone who's asking whether inclusion and diversity are oppositional, would one, wipe out the other? I must say this because I chaired the cross-cultural task force for two presidents who are speaking here, Alissandra Cummins and Hans-Martin Hinz. And this used to be a common fear of a lot of people is that, oh, well, if you talk about inclusion, our jobs are not safe. Our jobs means largely whatever the dominant color is, white, whatever. And that's not true. I mean, the ICOM theme is very clear. It says inclusion, diversity, and when it says equality and diversity, equality is an aspiration. Equity is an outcome. We want equity. We want that outcome, whether it's access for people with disabilities, with gender, with people of color, race, ethnicity, color, sexual orientation, age, you name it, economic status, all those cultural borders. We want an equitable situation, but equality is an aspiration. And similarly, diversity, I can't see it negating inclusion because the world has always been historically and socially, culturally, and linguistically diverse. India has been culturally, linguistically diverse for thousands of years. It's not something that people have discovered because of some policy now. But there are inequities within that diversity for various legacy reasons. How do museums, which are still dominated by the elites, actually become inclusive to have multiple voices, to have multiple people, multivocality, multiple people participating in this whole process? And that's what I would like to say. We got one more minute, and I'm going to give each panelist 20 seconds, no, 1 minute. We can go over the time a little bit. If you want to say something, Alissandra, starting off with you. Shadwari, could you focus on here?
How can you give me 1 minute to respond to all of that? That's really unfair.
Madam Chair, when you chaired meetings, you always restricted people to their time. So I thought this is.
Okay. All right. So what I will answer you is that a lot of these questions come out of another kind of colonialism, not so much the colonialism of objects, which I totally agree are critical and important conversation that continues, and I really admire the efforts that are being undertaken in some of the European countries. I don't admire some of the attitudes that still insist on treating them as trophies instead of the attributes of various communities. But what I will say is that I think there needs to be a greater understanding about the coloniality of knowledge, and that coloniality of knowledge has so informed and infused many of the older museums, even the museum model, which continues to separate and segregate certain elements of information and history into small categories. It decides on what history is, but doesn't like to hear about memory. It decides that certain things are ethnographic, but not necessarily indigenous. It decides the development of museums and exhibitions all over the Western world have been informed by that coloniality of knowledge. And it needs to be better understood that we need to address this at the basis of what we're doing to let go of systems of museum development, which were essentially about control of knowledge, as well as control of resources, and that includes the human resource. We need to understand that we need to deconstruct that kind of tradition of knowledge and structuring of information within museums. Thank you.
Thanks, Alissandra. Hans-Martin.
I have more a question. I really want to know concerning the situation of many museums in the current crisis. if museums are in danger, and how do we get the information and in order that allows us to help to develop a kind of solidarity with those museums who are in danger. So I guess no museum should be go bankrupt, but probably this is the case, and we do not know about it. Is it possible to organize somehow that we as the museum community can react to such developments, and that we probably can work as a lobby group in such difficult cases?
Thank you, Hans Martin. I think that that's a question that people have to answer. Now, Elke, you heard Alissandra, coloniality, contextuality. You organized the ICOM Austria annual conference around this theme in the first week of December. And I'd like to, pull these proceedings to an end with you commenting. Come on, the next generation, Elke.
Thank you for giving me this chance. Yes, we had 2 big symposia in Vienna about the topic of colonialism in museums, and the first one was about the colonialism in the Austrian collections, and the second one, where I had the pleasure to invite Amar to give the keynote speak and come to Vienna, was more internationally orientated and focused on the different perspective on science, how to treat this problem and how to better either give objects back or at the first step push forward provenience research, so that we exactly know what has happened, if there is an illegal context, if there's a context of a colonialism, or if some pieces might have come to the collections completely legally also. We are just working on a publication to document those 2 symposia, and we hope to finalize it by the end of the year. So this will be something to look forward to. Just one more aspect on concerned about the respect of local people. I am working a lot in the field of protection of heritage, also against illegal and illicit trafficking. So it's key, if you want to safeguard heritage, to have the local people work with you. So I completely agree that the local people must be integrated in any kind of heritage production, and about how museums will collect the current situation of the COVID crisis. Just let me tell you, just because museums are not open to the public, they are not closed. The people are working there, and they keep active, and small museums and big museums, at least here in Austria, are very actively collecting objects, and they're asking their communities to contribute. So this is also a good way to activate people in this time of crisis, and maybe something that gives us a little bit of hope that we stay connected, and that museums will thrive and flourish, and that everything comes back together soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Elke. That's, yes, just because we're not open, we're not closed. I love that. Hans Martin, I think one of the things UNESCO, ICOM, all these bodies have to really seriously think about is disaster preparedness is always focused on, tsunamis and, quite rightly, earthquakes and so on. But nobody has actually anticipated, despite pandemics before, because a lot of Indian colleagues tell me that those pandemics did not affect Western countries, but this pandemic has affected Western countries. And so this pandemic is global. So it is a global concern, to address this. This pandemic is also about climate change. And the ozone layer is already healing, it's already closing. which is quite amazing in such a short period. And people's health and well-being is being improved because of reduced or pollution from people not using cars. And Elke made suggestions about how people could reduce their flying around. So all these things needs to be, as a result of the experience of this pandemic, should not be forgotten. They should be taken into consideration on what kind of disaster preparedness do we deal with? Do we establish resilient funds? Do we have resilient funds? I mean, this is one thing that the Aboriginal people of Australia, through the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Arts Board, are arguing in webinars, is that we must have a resilient fund for unseen situations like this. So, you know, there are a whole range of issues that have come up. But one of the things I want to say in concluding is most countries do not have national museum policies. In fact, they don't even have national cultural policies, forget them. And so those countries that are trying to deal with the pandemic are suddenly doing things ad hoc, not within a policy framework. And this is a big concern. For example, Elke referred to illicit traffic, you know, because in most countries, museum security is outsourced, right? And outsourced to small companies which can't survive, you know, right now. So what about the security of small museums? And in fact, you know, I have information from colleagues at Interpol that in fact the pandemic is being used as an opportunity by people to be involved in illicit traffic and cultural property. So this is disastrous because we talk about repatriation and return, but things are being stolen. So there's a whole range of issues that are coming up. There are a lot of questions. I'm sorry we could not address all of them. We're already over time. And I want to once again acknowledge all of you for making your time to join us. And I also want to acknowledge my university, Anant National University, which has generously been hosting webinars and all kinds of online activities. It's not just museums, it's universities too. We're doing it too. And talking of synergies, we're working with all of you in museums and everywhere else. So I would like to publicly acknowledge Anant National University and its provost, Ananoya Chaube, whose initiative it is that we use webinars, which are seminars on the web. I know there's a tsunami of webinars, but most webinars are not actually webinars. In fact, a webinar is a seminar on the web, but most webinars have got no seminal ideas. Hey, let's get together and get some visibility. Let's chat. Well, why not? I think during lockdown, that's not a bad thing, but they're not necessarily webinars. But thank you for dealing with so many seminal ideas, suggestions. We'll keep in touch. Thank you very much. And everybody, people are still, 144 people are still logged in, which is quite amazing. Take care, everyone. It'll all be over soon. We'll all come out of it together. And as our panelists have said, solidarity, working together, all these things are very important as we move forward. And thank you very much. Thank you. And have a very nice night, morning, whatever, wherever you are. Ciao, bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We've shared the Facebook Live link in the chat box. You can access the recording there. We'll be sending out the invite for the next webinar and the recording for this webinar in the coming week. Thank you for joining us today. Have a good night. Thank you.
Yeah. By the way, those of you still logged in, quite a large number, we will send out an email about all these things on the uploading, once the recording is uploaded and where you can access. So thank you. Oh, this is like old ICOM meetings. Nobody wants to go. I love it.
Thank you, Amar. Thank you, Amar, for your initiative. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It's teamwork. It's teamwork.
Very much. I enjoyed it. And good to hear from everybody. Elke, you haven't invited me to one of your seminars.
Ah, there you are, Elke.
Time, next time.
I'm looking forward to seeing the book.
Because
Yeah.
these issues really have to be discussed continually. So it would be a great pleasure to welcome you here. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Elke. Thank you.
Hope to see you all soon again.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.